Good morning, everyone. So what I'm going to go over with you this morning is how to fill out the as-is residential contract for sale and purchase here in the Florida market. And so before we get started, I just kind of want to talk about a few things. So before you decide on which contract you're going to use, it's important that you understand the differences. So for the as-is contract, it's exactly that. It's as-is. It's whether the seller is telling you in the MLS that their property is as-is and they're not going to make any repairs. That would trigger you to have a conversation with your buyers to let them know that the buyer upfront is telling you that they're not going to make repairs and you should submit the contract on an as-is contract. Now, there are a lot of times that sellers are not selling their home as is. And so buyers will choose to do an as is contract to be more competitive. But it's important to communicate to your buyers and make sure that they understand that when they're submitting an as is offer to a seller and to a listing agent, they are sending that upfront saying that we will not ask for repairs. So they need to know that going in. So if they're concerned after you show a property that there's a lot of work that needs to be done and they want to ask for repairs, do not submit your offer on an as-is contract. Do not ask for repairs in the as-is contract. Now, that doesn't mean that if you go and show the property and they're not too concerned about what repairs are going to come and you get to the inspection period and there are several big ticket items like, let's say, the roof or the hot water heater or the HVAC needs to be replaced. It doesn't mean that at that time you can't negotiate with the seller and the listing agent to keep that contract together and maybe do a reduction in price or a credit towards closing costs, or just have the actual repair be done. But going in, when you initially submit your contract, do not ask for repairs. Otherwise, you should use the regular FAR contract. Okay, so make sure that your buyers understand upfront the differences between the two. Okay, the second thing that we're going to talk about is the contract. So let's get started. So I pulled up a contract for an offer that I had written for a buyer, just so that it's already pre-populated and we can kind of go through it because I think it's easier when you can actually see the data in here. Okay, so your parties. You're going to get the seller from the MLS and or the tax record. So if you don't know how to pull up the tax record, go to the MLS. And up here, I have it saved as a favorite, but you can go to menu and go down here to let's see, hack search. Okay, and it'll pull it up for you. Okay, and so I already have it open here. So here we go. Here is the seller. So that's what you're going to populate in your contract. Now, your buyers, you need to ask your buyers, basically, are they both going to be on the contract? If they're both going to take title in both of their names, and then you want to put the husband and a wife, or you want to put maybe two friends, or if they're taking title in the ownership of a corporation, you want to put it in however the buyer tells you. Okay, if it's a trust, make sure that if a trust is purchasing it, that you get a copy of the trust document so that you can copy the trust verbiage word for word and put that in your buyer line. Okay, so the next thing is the property address. So you'll get this obviously from MLS. And again, make sure that you're checking the address to make sure that it's correct. This will be a legally binding contract between the buyer and the seller. So you want to make sure that when you're completing this, that you're checking and making sure all your information is accurate. So once you type in the address, you're going to put in the county. This is in Santa Rosa County. And to get your tax ID, I always verify it against the MLS. I don't copy from the MLS. I copy from the tax record. So again, go over to your tax record and your parcel is right here. And you can copy and paste that. You can validate it against the MLS, but again, it's better to take everything from the tax record because again, as agents, I'm sure that we know sometimes agents don't always do their due diligence and they make mistakes as well. So you want to make sure that you are putting an offer in on the correct property. If you're not, then the deal could fall apart because it wouldn't be a legitimate offer. You could be submitting an offer on a property that is not for sale if your parcel and your legal description are not correct. So here's your you just click copy and then go back to your contract and you would click paste. Legal description, same way. So go back to your tax, CRS tax, and scroll down to the very bottom. And here is your full legal description. This is the best place to get it because sometimes on the tax bill or the property appraiser website, it will tell you like this is the shortened version. This isn't the full legal description. So you want to make sure that you have the full legal description. The other place that you can go is you can go to the county records and search for the deed and pull the legal description from an actual previous deed for the seller listed on the tax record. So again, you just right click copy and then go back to your contract and click paste. Okay, so the next thing that we want to talk about is personal property. So if you read this, it's going to tell you all of the following items which are owned by the seller and existing on the property as of the date of the offer are included in the purchase. So just because I've done it forever, I always put in appliances to include the refrigerator, oven, dishwasher viewed at the time of showing will convey with sale. So again, it's telling you all of these things are in here. So maybe what you say is all appliances, viewed at the time of showing will convey with sale. If there's more than one refrigerator, so like, let's say there's a refrigerator in the garage. If the buyers want that to stay, make sure that you're putting that in here as well. If there is a washer and dryer are not listed here. Neither are, let's say, storage sheds. So any personal property that the buyer wants the seller to leave needs to be put in this other personal property area. If the list is too long because there's only so many characters, then put C attached and do an attachment A or an exhibit A and put that in here and then send that with your contract. Again, it's better to err on the side of caution and to put everything in here. I have had a situation in the past where even with this language up here and even all appliances to include refrigerator viewed at the time of showing, I did have a seller who took the garage refrigerator and put it in the kitchen and took the kitchen refrigerator with them. So again, it doesn't specify that this is the refrigerator in the kitchen. It just specifies refrigerator. So again, a lot of times sellers are not going to be sneaky or try to be, malicious or anything like that. But again, you just want to be specific. So in that instance, we delayed closing and the seller had to replace with the correct refrigerator. So there are ways to get to fix those types of issues. But again, the more specific you can be here and the more diligent you are to find out specifically what the buyer wants the seller to leave, make sure that you put that here and that'll just help you in the long run. Now, if you're on the seller side and you receive an offer, if they put the storage shed here and you're planning on taking the storage shed, or if you're planning on taking the kitchen refrigerator, then you need to update either on the contract or in a counter offer that those are going to be excluded from purchase. So again, you have due diligence that you have to do on the listing side as well when you receive a contract to make sure that you're checking these two lines here to say, this is what the buyer is asking you to leave, or maybe the buyer doesn't want the washer and dryer because they already have a brand new set. So you want to leave them and they don't want them. Then they would say, the washer and dryer are not, we don't want them. The seller needs to take those. So you would put that in this line item here. If you have any other questions on that, please always feel free to reach out. Okay, so purchase price. So on this one was $185,000. They put $1,500 down. I will tell you, you really don't want to do an earnest money deposit for less than $1,000. And ideally, going rate is 1% of the purchase price. Now, I know that all depends on your buyer's finances, and sometimes they don't have that much money, but you need to explain to them that this is their good faith, a show of good faith when they're placing an offer, that they're serious. So the higher the earnest deposit, the better the offer looks to the seller. So again, we didn't quite go at 1%. That was due to buyer financials. But again, ideally, you want to strive for 1% of the purchase price. Most times these days, buyers are wiring in their earnest money. So it doesn't really accompany the offer. A long time ago, this will show my age, I used to make my buyers write a check out to the title company and shoot me a copy of it. And I would actually send a copy of the check with the offer. You can still do that. But again, most everybody today is wiring the earnest money. So I just click check, and then I also do 3 days. Now, again, we're talking calendar days here. So for instance, if you put, let's say your effective date is Thursday, then Friday is day 1, Saturday is day 2, Sunday is day 3. So it's due on Sunday, but we can't have a due date for a deadline in this contract outside of time and acceptance and the effective date as a Sunday or a weekend or a holiday. So if Monday is not a holiday, then Monday at midnight would be the deadline for this earnest check to be through. Make sure that you are keeping up on all of your deadlines because if they don't receive the check or the wire funds by day 3, then your buyer is in breach of contract. Okay. I know that you could watch 10 different brokers tell you how to do a contract, and they're going to give you 10 different ways on various parts of this contract on how to fill it out or what their preferences are. And I've watched about 50 different brokers give training on these Florida contracts, as well as Florida lawyers. So what I'm going to tell you here is there are people that will tell you this can be left blank and filled in later. I do not recommend that, because then it's just something that you have to go back and fill in later. So if you are expecting the seller to pay for the title company, then make a phone call. You should be calling the seller's agent anyway to find out what is important and motivating to the seller to make your offer stronger, whether it's just the bottom line, so cash, whether it's closing date, whether it's post-closing occupancy. At that point in time, when you're calling to find out what is important to the seller, have them text you their title company information, and they will do that. I do that all the time. So make sure that you have the title company contact here. If your sellers are going to be paying if the sellers are going to be paying title, that you're using the title company that the listing agent provides you. Do not leave this blank. If the buyer is providing title, then you should already have your contact information. And just future note going forward, we're having a discussion with the home office in Oklahoma City, that what we would like to do as a company, and they all kind of already do this in Oklahoma City, but we're wanting to expand it to Texas and to Florida, is we're wanting to have a select few title companies that we use, that the whole company uses within the Florida market, where we're building strong relationships with those title companies, because number one, they'll go to bat for us. It's easier sometimes if they know they're gonna get all of your business, they'll move you to the front of the line. We'll get special treatment, and then also they can help us with some of our marketing dollars. They can put money towards our marketing dollars to help us market our services and do things like that. So in the future, we will probably have a select number of title companies that Brix is going to work with, and it will also be the same for lenders as well. So again, the same benefits with lenders. They contribute to our marketing dollars, which helps us get our name out there. And again, if you build those relationships with a select few number of lenders, then, they're more willing to take your phone call at 8 p.m. at night. Or, really go above and beyond for you, because you are giving them a lot of business, and then they are inclined to give us business when potential buyers reach out to them first. So again, that's something that's coming. We'll figure out what lenders, we're going to partner with, and what title companies we're going to partner with, and then we'll send that out to everybody. And then we need to do our best when we're in control of that to be able to use those particular providers. Okay, so again, $185 is the purchase price. $1,500 was the earnest deposit. Some people do additional deposits. If you do that, that's fine. Just again, make sure that you're following up on your dates and that you're putting in the time frame and the dollar amount for the second earnest deposit. Most of the contracts I've written, the buyer doesn't want to do additional earnest money, so we leave that at zero. So here, this is where these two lines here, this line, line 39 and line 42, get really confusing for people when they fill out the contract. So there's two ways to do it here. This is a VA buyer, so it's 100% financing, okay? So the purchase price is $185 and the deposit is $1,500. If they're financing 100%, you could put 100% in here, or you could subtract $185 from $1,500 and get $183.5. Now, this line is what their balance to close is, not including their closing costs. So it's not going to be their cash to close. That's going to be something completely different. This is just strictly the financials taking in the earnest money and their down payment. Okay. So I'm going to show you a way that I am sure that I'm doing it right, because again, like I said, this is your contract. This is a binding document. So you want to make sure your numbers are correct. So Florida Realtors provides you access to Form Simplicity. And I really like the Form Simplicity contract, because I'll show you why. So for instance, it auto-populates. .loop does not do that. So if I type in 185, here, let me clear these out so that you can see this. Okay, if I type in 185 and then I type in 1,500, it automatically populates to 183.5. So like if I put in 2,000, see how it changed it to 183? Okay, so they put in 1,500. Okay, so now if I put in 100% financing, and you have to put the percent sign, it's going to show you that basically they're going to have it looks like a $1,500 credit. It's actually not a $1,500 credit. It's going to go towards their closing costs. And so you can leave it like this and submit it exactly like this. That is totally okay. But what I'll tell you happens, and this is why I put zero here, is because there are people out there that are just not as well versed in the contracts as we are. And so I've had lenders, and I've also had title companies say, what's the $1,500 credit for? And it's like, it's not a credit. It's literally the difference between the purchase price, since it's being financed at 100%, this 1,500 is going to go towards their closing costs, right? It's money they've already paid that's going to go towards their closing costs, but it can cause issues. So for me, I zero it out, because then it doesn't cause any questions. Okay. I did have one. In fact, this happened 2 weeks ago. So I sent an offer just like this. It was another VA customer. I put 0 here. The listing agent, before they would sign the contract, said, no. It needs to look just like this with the negative 1,500. And I'm like, okay. And I specifically told him what I just told you guys. I've sent it this way before, and it causes questions with title and the lender, but I'm happy to change it because it says the same thing. Okay. So we did that. And I'm not even kidding you. I had the lender and the title company email both of us and say, so there's a $1,500 credit on the contract. So anyway, whatever you choose to do, this is absolutely correct formatting if you want to do it this way. However, you can do it this way as well and put 0 here. I've seen some people put balance, the word balance. You can do that as well. Here again, I want to show you a different one, just so that you know. So let's say, and everybody has a Florida Realtors login ID, and this is just Form Simplicity. So you can just go to Form Simplicity. Here, I'll show you. You can just go, you log into Form Simplicity, and when you pull it up, it looks just like this. And then you would just go to blank forms and then pull up the as is residential contract. And I usually just use it for the dollar amount to make sure that I'm correct, calculating it correctly. I know how to do it, but just as a checks and balance, because again, this is a legal and binding document, I do this. So let's say it's a $300,000 property and they are putting $3,000 down. It changes it to $297, but these buyers are pretty strong. And so they're putting 20% down, which means they're going to finance 80%. So you want to put what they're financing here, not the down payment. So then it subtracts the difference, right? And so if you go to your calculator and you check that, if we do 300,000 times 80%, you get $240,000. Okay. And then, so the difference between 300,000 and 240 is $60,000. So 57,000, which is what it's showing they need to bring, plus their earnest money that they've already paid, is $60,000. That's how you can do that quick check. So anyway, you don't have to do this, but if you have a question, Form Simplicity is great because it auto-populates. Unfortunately, .loop does not do that. Form Simplicity does. Okay, so back to .loop. So that takes care of the purchase price and the offer price. Okay, so here, time for acceptance. You can leave this blank. I usually don't, especially over the last 2 years, because our market has been so crazy here that buyers really want to know if their offer is accepted. And so we always put in an expiration date. If you don't, then it says, unless otherwise stated, the time for acceptance of any counter offers shall be 2 days after the date the counter offer is delivered. Okay, so there's no expiration date. They would just basically, within any counter offers that they're going to give you, it's 2 days after the date the counter offer is delivered. Okay. And the other thing too, when you're calling and talking to your listing agent, make sure that you ask them, if I give you 24 hours, is that enough time? So that you can set expectations with your buyer that, hey, the sellers are on vacation and they're not going to be able to get back to us for 48 hours. Make sure that you're checking to make sure that the time frame that you're giving the listing agent and the seller to review the contract is enough for them to do that. Closing. Okay, so here a lot of people put on or before. Totally acceptable. That just means that if everything is done prior to, let's say, 6/9, which was what was on this contract, then you can close before then. You don't have to put on or before. You can always close early. But sometimes it makes the seller feel better when they see an offer that says on or before, because then they know. But if they've got a good listing agent, we can always close before the closing date if both parties agree to it, and it's not going to cause any logistical issues. Because again, most everybody works to the date that's put on the contract, especially if a seller is moving. They've got to line up their moving companies. So if you're trying to close before the 9th, you want to make sure that you are giving enough time and working with the listing agent so that logistically they can set up their movers to be out if you're going to close early and not on the date that's in the contract. Again, I'm going to go over high level here. I'm going to talk about some things, but for the most part, you need to read this contract, get very, very familiar with it. The as-is residential contract is used in about 95% of all Florida transactions. So while we do have two other contracts, we have the regular FAR and then we have the CRISP contract. Brix does not use the CRISP contract. So make sure that you're familiar with the regular FAR, which would be if your buyer would like to ask for repairs and they know that up front, or again, the as-is contract, which is the one that is predominantly used in our market. Okay, so here it talks about the extension of closing date. This is just saying that if for some reason that the buyer's lender is not able to provide the CD, then as long as loan approval has been obtained, so you've got that clear to close, underwriting is complete, then closing can be extended for 7 days. This is an automatic extension. However, I always recommend that you do an addendum anytime that you're extending the closing date. Get the buyer and seller to sign it, because if you're the listing agent, you're going to have to go in and update the MLS to change your closing date. So you want to be able to have a document that states that. So make sure that you're doing an addendum if you're extending the closing date. Okay. Occupancy and possession. This is just basically saying what the seller is going to do. So at closing, they're going to have removed all personal items and trash from the property. They're going to deliver keys, garage door openers, access devices, etc. Okay. This is really important from a seller perspective, that the listing agent, if you have a seller, that you are telling them that everything on the day of closing, including trash, needs to be removed. Now, it's okay if they want to take their trash and put it at the end of the driveway for trash pickup, but all of their personal belongings, including their trash, need to be gone. You don't leave that for the buyers, and that happens a lot. And buyers have to suck it up a lot. So just make sure that you're having that conversation with your seller to let them know that they need to pre-plan to make sure that they're getting all of their trash taken care of before closing day. Okay, the next one is you're going to check here if the property is subject to a lease or after occupancy closing. Okay, so if it's subject to a lease, that's a whole different, that's a whole new set of tasks and documentation that has to be gone through. And you would actually, if it's post-closing occupancy by the seller, then you have a rider U that you need to attach to this document, as well as you'll have to have a lease agreement that is signed for by the buyer and the seller that they both agree to, that outlines the post-closing occupancy. If it is a lease, then as the buyer agent, you're going to want to make sure that you pay attention closely to this paragraph here, because the seller needs to provide copies of the written lease to the buyer within 5 days after the effective date. And then if the buyer looks over that lease, in their sole discretion, if the terms are not acceptable, the buyer can terminate the contract by delivery of written notice within 5 days after receipt. so the buyer can get out if it's under a lease and they don't like the terms of the agreement. The other thing that goes forward is you need to check out standard D, because there is an estoppel letter that the seller must provide to the buyer, and the estoppel letter is for the tenants. And so basically the tenants fill out this document saying, here's the rent I pay, here is the deposit that I paid, here's the pet deposit I paid, and I am current on, all of my payments up to this date. And it's a formal document that is sent to the buyer for them to review. So again, standard D, make sure that you're familiar if you're doing a lease or occupancy after closing for your seller. Assignability. Okay, so again, what you always want to check is that the buyer may not assign this contract. There are wholesalers in our area, and so if you see one especially that says may assign and therefore be released from further liability, that's a huge red flag. And you want to follow up with the if you're the seller, you want to follow up with the buyer's agent and say, why do you have this checked? Who are they going to assign it to? Because you don't want to go under contract as a seller and then have them assign it, but then this particular buyer that signed the contract with you has no liability, okay? Because your seller's taking the property off the market. So again, what we always want to see is may not assign this contract. If you see any of these other boxes checked, you need to reach out to the buyer's agent and get an explanation as to why, and make sure you get that explanation in writing. So I had one on the condo that is under contract right now. And when it came over, it says may assign but not be released from liability. So I called the buyer's agent and I said, hey, what's going on with this? So it was an individual, and he was purchasing the property with his flipping company, but he couldn't get a hold of his attorney to be able to determine if it would be better financially for him to purchase it as an individual or with his company. So the only person that he would be transferring it to would be himself. And so I got that in writing, and I felt comfortable enough with that we went ahead and left it be that way. The buyer's agent also told me, hey, if you have a problem with this, then we can just modify the contract to make it be may not assign this contract. So again, buyer's agents are usually willing to work with you, but make sure as a seller's agent, you are checking this and you want to see may not assign this contract. Okay, the financing section. Obviously, if it's a cash transaction, you click A, and there's no financing contingency. That means none of 8 applies if it's a cash transaction, okay? So there's no way really, without an appraisal contingency put in here, that a cash buyer is going to be able to get out of this contract, except for during the inspection period. So just keep that in mind. There's no way really for a regular buyer outside of a cash buyer to get out of this contract outside of the inspection period because of a low appraisal. So if you have a conventional buyer or a cash buyer and they're concerned about the appraisal, then you need to include the appraisal contingency rider so that way they're protected. And if the home falls below the purchase price, then they have the ability to get out of the contract. Now with VA and FHA, the appraisal contingency is already built in. So if you're writing an as-is contract for a VA or FHA buyer, you have to use the VA FHA addendum, and it has the appraisal contingency built in. So you don't need it. It would be redundant. Okay. So this contract, this one was a finance contract. Always fill in your blanks. Okay. Don't be a lazy realtor. Always fill in your blanks. You're representing Brix, but you're also representing yourself. And when you present your contracts to another agent, you want them to be clean and you want them to be accurate and you want them to be complete. So always fill in your blanks. Okay, so here, contract 30 days. Make sure that you're talking to your lender to verify that they can do a 30-day close. With the changes that happened last November, the appraisal has to be back within the loan approval period. So make sure that, especially if you're working with an out-of-state lender, that's not necessarily familiar with how our market works here, the appraisal needs to be ordered on day one. And the reason for that is because, again, in order for the lender to give loan approval, the appraisal has to be back. So you want to make sure that you're having that conversation with your lender to say, is 30 days enough for you to do the appraisal and all of the underwriting and give loan approval within 30 days? If yes, fantastic. If not, adjust your date here. You check the loan type, so VA, and then down here it says and I leave this blank because I'm not putting a percentage in here. It's going to be the prevailing rate. So I don't know what the prevailing rate's going to be. So this is a blank that you can actually leave blank. And it's going to be the prevailing rate. Okay, for a term of 30 years. So as long as it's a 30-year term, great. If you've got a buyer doing a 15-year mortgage, make sure that you're paying attention to that on the pre-approval and that you're not putting 30 years when it's 15. Buyers shall make application for financing within 5 days of the effective date. So if you were a seller and you got a pre-qual letter, you didn't get a pre-approval letter, you got a pre-qual letter, then you want to be following up for your seller to make sure that the buyer has made application for financing with the lender within 5 days of the effective date. If not, they're in breach of contract. I always send an email, and I even do it if I get a pre-approval letter, because I do know that there are some lenders out there that give a pre-approval letter where they haven't got an application yet. So again, just make sure that you're looking out for whichever party that you're representing. So if you are representing the seller, you want to make sure that within 5 days, you've got a little reminder on your calendar to check with the lender to make sure that they've received the application. Okay. It also talks about the buyer has to use good faith and diligent effort to obtain loan approval during the loan approval period to make sure that if something were to happen and they needed to get their earnest money deposit back, this is going to be what the criteria is to determine that. So if the lender is asking for documents, you need to make sure that you're working with your buyer to get those documents to your lender. It also says buyer shall, upon written request, keep the seller and the broker informed of the buyer's status of the mortgage loan application, loan processing, appraisal, and loan approval. So only if they ask you at this point do you have to provide an answer. But if they do ask, then you need to get an answer, whether you're having your lender provide the update or whether you're providing it. If the seller asks what the status is, then you need to provide it. Okay, so these paragraphs here, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are very important, and I encourage you to read over them and over them and over them and understand. Okay, so 3 says, basically, I'm going to give it to you high level first. You need to communicate before the loan approval period is up that 1, yes, I have loan approval. No, I don't have loan approval, but I'm confident I'm going to get it and I want to move forward. No, I don't have loan approval and I want to cancel the contract. Okay, 3 things. If you are silent and you say nothing before loan approval and you don't get approved, then this basically becomes a cash transaction and you lose all your financial contingency protections. And the seller is able to cancel the contract. Okay, so let's go back and read these because, again, I just threw a lot at you. Okay, so if within the loan approval period, buyer obtains loan approval. So here's your first one, you get it. Buyer shall notify the seller in writing, not via text, in email, prior to the expiration of loan approval. If the buyer is unable to obtain loan approval within the loan approval period, but the buyer is satisfied with the buyer's ability to obtain loan approval and proceed to closing, buyer shall deliver written notice, email, not text, to confirm the same prior to the expiration of loan approval. Okay? The next one, if buyer is unable to obtain loan approval within the loan approval period and cannot timely meet the terms of loan approval, all after exercise of good faith and diligent effort, buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice, again, email, not text, of termination to the seller prior to the expiration of the loan approval period. So you have to terminate prior to the expiration of the loan approval period. Whereupon buyer is not in default under the terms of this contract, the buyer shall be refunded the deposit, thereby releasing the buyer and seller from all further obligations of this contract. Now, the other option here that you can do, and it's not mentioned, is so you can either say, yes, I got loan approval and I'm moving forward. No, I didn't get loan approval, but I think I'm going to, and I'm moving forward. No, I don't have loan approval. I'm not going to get it and I'm going to cancel. Or you can extend the loan approval period. Now, sometimes sellers don't want to extend the loan approval period. So again, that requires the seller to agree to that. But if your lender's trying to work some magic and they think that they'll be able to get it in another week, then you can always formally extend the loan approval period versus just saying, yeah, I'm confident and I want to move forward. You absolutely can extend it, with an addendum. Okay. So here's the kicker. If buyer fails to timely deliver any written notice, so you're silent, you say nothing, as provided for in paragraphs 3 and 4, the seller, prior to the expiration of the loan approval period, then the buyer shall proceed forward with this contract as though 8A above has been checked as of the effective date. So if you're silent and you say nothing, then it says the contract basically becomes a cash transaction as if paragraph 8A was checked. So you lose all your finance contingency protections. Okay. However, the seller may elect to terminate this contract by delivering written notice of termination to the buyer within 3 days after the expiration of the loan approval period. And provided the buyer is not in default, the buyer shall be refunded their deposit, thereby releasing the buyer and seller from further obligations of this contract. Okay, so here's why this is important. It is your responsibility as the buyer's agent to make sure that you are communicating to the listing agent, to the seller, what your loan approval looks like. If you're silent and you say nothing and the seller is frustrated because maybe you've had some other hiccups before this and they want to terminate the contract, they're well within their rights to do that if you have not communicated with them. How frustrated and upset is your buyer going to be with you when the seller wants to cancel the contract and they legitimately can because you were silent on their behalf? You're probably going to lose a client, especially if they really loved the house. So just make sure that you are communicating in writing via email what your loan approval period is. And honestly, you need to be communicating. I know it's frustrating that when they did the contract update here, they took out text messaging as a form of communication because we do so much via text, and I'm guilty of it as well. But anything that you are communicating with your buyer, with your seller, to another agent, to a lender, to a title company that is crucial and important to the transaction, you must communicate via email. It protects you, it protects your buyer or your seller, and it protects the brokerage. We have to keep records for all transactions for 5 years. So there's no way that we would keep text messages for 5 years. I mean, I'm randomly cleaning out my text messages, all the time. So again, it's important to use your Brix email, and it's important to communicate via email on all things regarding the transaction. That way, the brokerage has that stored on a server so that in case we ever get audited, it can save you. It can save you. It can save the broker. It can save the buyer and or seller. So just make sure that you're always following that correct process. Okay, so here we are. These two are not, I've never seen them checked. So if your buyer has an FHA mortgage, that's an assumable mortgage. Now, I'll tell you, we might start seeing these because interest rates have been historically low for the last 5 to 7 years, right? And now our interest rates are high. So if you have a buyer that bought a home 3 or 4 years ago, FHA, and their interest rate sitting at 3%, and today's rates are sitting at 5.5%, they may want to advertise an assumption of an existing mortgage. Now, I caution you that unless you're an expert in the lending field and or accounting field and or legal field, that if your buyer or seller want to do this, that they need to speak to legal counsel, tax counsel, and lender counsel before they decide that this is what they want to do, to make sure that it makes sense. So again, we haven't seen these very often. We may start seeing them as we go forward. So that's what that is. And then there's a rider D that goes along with that if they're placing, if they want to assume an existing mortgage. The next one is purchase money note. That's seller financing. Again, I don't recommend seller financing to any of my sellers because, again, they're holding a mortgage for a buyer. So, that's going to affect their credit, their financing. So again, if they want to do that, they need to understand the implications, the financial and tax implications of doing that. And that's not advice that we can give. So make sure that they're reaching out to their tax accountant, and or legal representation to make sure that what they're doing is in their best interest. And again, there's a separate rider for that one as well. Okay, closing costs. So here are the closing costs outlined that the buyer and or seller will be paying. If you're going to change something and add it in additional comments, please make sure that you put see section 20 on here, just to there's other people looking at this contract besides you. And so while because you wrote the contract, that you're putting additional terms in, it doesn't hurt to give the lender and the title company a heads up to say, oh, hey, there's additional closing costs that are going to be paid by the seller, or, oh, hey, there's going to be additional closing costs paid by the buyer. I need to see section 20. It's just a courtesy. It's not required, but I do recommend that you do that. Okay, so down here, title and evidence. This is your title. You should get within 15 days, or if it's a cash transaction, 5 days, a title insurance commitment from the title company. Okay, so here in Florida, in our area, we're either going to check 1 or 2. Typically, in a normal market, the seller in our area usually always designates the closing agent and pays for the owner title policy. The owner title policy is basically just a policy that's going to protect the new buyer in case somebody comes and makes a claim that they own the property or want to sue and put a lien on the property because they have some interest in it. That's what that owner policy protects. The seller usually does that. It's basically them saying, hey, I'm going to provide a policy because I'm saying that everything's good, but if something were to come up from a previous ownership, you're covered, okay? If you click the seller and you're representing the buyer, then again, make sure that you call and find out from the listing agent who they want to use and put that in your contract. If you're the buyer and you want to designate the closing agent and pay for the owner's title policy, then check B. And here's what I'll tell you on this. So when you are a buyer or you're representing a buyer, I think it's always best to try to convince the buyer to be able to choose the closing agent. And I'll tell you why. Once you have a relationship with your title company, you have confidence in them and you work and you have got a good working relationship with them. And, I have title companies that I've got their cell phone numbers that I can reach out to the closing agent in the evening. And I don't do it very often, but if something has come up, I know they'll answer me. If I'm using the seller's title company, I may not have a relationship with them. And therefore, I'm not going to get any answers until maybe the next day. And maybe I'm not going to be at the top of their list. So it does add fees that the buyer has to pay for sure. And so you want to make sure that when you're doing your buyer net sheet, that if they're going to pay for the title company, that if they're going to pick the title company and pay for the title policy, that you're adding that into the buyer net sheet so that they can see how much that's adding to their closing costs. But you also can explain the advantage to them is, hey, I've got a great working relationship with Aqua Title, and I know that they'll get us to the closing table. I don't know that if we go with the sellers. Again, it's a choice. It does, if the buyer pays for it, it makes your offer look stronger. So I know that that's been used a lot in the last couple years to try to make your offer stand out amongst the competition. Okay, so the next section is just for Miami-Dade. That doesn't apply to us. Survey. So as a seller, you have to provide a current survey, if you have one, at least 5 days prior to closing. Now, I will tell you that you do not, as a buyer representing the buyer, want to wait for the seller to provide the survey 5 days prior to closing, because title has to review it and make sure that there's no issues and make sure that nothing else has been put on that property since the seller provided the survey. So for instance, let's say the seller has a survey that's 5 years old and they have a copy of it and they're going to provide it. When the title company gets it, they're going to reach out to the seller and say, have you done anything to the property, like put in a fence, put in a patio, put in a pool, put in a shed? Have you done anything, made any changes to your property? And the seller's like, oh yeah, I installed a pool and I put up a fence. Guess what? That survey is no longer valid. And the next sentence says, the buyer may, at the buyer's expense, have to pay for a new survey. So if they're getting financing, you have to have a survey to close. So if you wait until 5 days prior to closing for the seller to provide that survey, and you find out that it's not going to work, the buyers are going to have to get a new one. Surveys right now, as of 2 weeks ago, are running 4 to 6 weeks in our area. You've just pushed closing a month to a month and a half. I follow up the day after the effective date. If I know, and it's one thing I'm asking too. So when I call my seller, if I know I'm going to be placing an offer and I'm asking what's important to the seller, and I'm finding out the age of the roof and the hot water heater and the HVAC, I'm also asking, do they have a survey? Because I want to try to provide up front, before we place the offer, all the expenses that I know that my buyer could potentially have to pay for, survey being one of them. So if the listing agent says, oh, nope, they don't have one, then I know it's easily going to be somewhere between $400 and $700 that my buyer is going to have to pay, in addition to everything else that I told them they were going to have to pay because the seller doesn't have a survey and they're getting financing and it's going to be required. So do not wait until 5 days before the closing date. Home warranty, again, not seen a lot if you are representing the seller, because it's been a seller's market and buyers are trying to be super competitive. And so they haven't been asking for home warranties. Doesn't mean that you can't. And it you can also put in here that the buyer will pay for it. So that the buyer can do it anyway, so it doesn't necessarily have to be written into the contract. Most of the time, you're going to write it in the contract if the seller is going to pay for a home warranty. So if it's not applicable, just put NA and NA. Special assessments. So what is important about this section here is to note that this is not assessments by the condominium or an HOA association. So it's not those assessments. It is assessments by a public body, which means the state, okay, or the county, right? So let's say you live in a subdivision and your roads are crap. And the county is like, oh my gosh, we're going to do new roads and we're going to charge an assessment to be able to do that. So that assessment gets added to your tax bill and is split up between the neighbors in your subdivision. Okay. Same thing can happen for sidewalks. Same thing can happen for like water main, street lights, you name it. One way to be able to check is to go to the tax record for this property and see if there are any non-ad valorem taxes listed. And if there are, then it would fall into here. So you have two choices for those types of assessments. If you click A, it's basically saying seller's going to pay the installments on their tax bill up into closing. And then once the buyer closes, the buyer's going to pay those installments after closing. Or you can say seller shall pay in full prior to or at the time of closing any assessments by a public body. Now, there are some assessments that the public body does not allow prepayment of. And so in those instances, it's going to default back to A. So what I'm saying is, I think A is a good option. It makes sense that whether you're a buyer or a seller, that the seller pays, up to closing and the buyer pays after closing. But if there are some significant assessments, then if you're representing the buyer, you might want to check that the seller shall pay those assessments in full if they can. But then explain to your buyer that if they can't, then they're going to have to take over those after closing. Okay, so that's the difference here. And again, it's nothing to do with the HOA or the condominium. It's strictly a public body. It's your city or your county. Okay, these are all your disclosures. So just read over these, make sure that you understand them. Your buyer may, have some questions. One thing that I do want to make sure that I let everyone know is this is a legal document and we are not attorneys. So if your buyer or seller has specific detailed questions regarding this contract, you need to refer them to an attorney to get a full legal understanding from a legal representative. So if they are asking about FIRPTA, which is basically if a foreign person is selling a property here in the United States, I can read this to them. I absolutely am able to read this paragraph to them. But if they have any specific questions regarding what this means to them as a buyer, they need to get legal representation and make sure that they understand that. Do not step outside of your lane as a realtor unless you can prove that you're an expert in any one of these categories. Make sure that you're staying within your own lane, right? Okay, so energy brochure. This is something that has to be provided to buyers. It is in the loop, but you want to make sure that on every contract or before you go under contract, I usually send it with the contract and have them initial it, that you're providing this Florida energy efficient rating information brochure. Okay, it's in the loop. Lead-based paint if the property is built before 78. Most of these documents, if you're representing the buyer, the seller should already have them uploaded in the MLS. If not, then you should be reaching out to the listing agent saying, hey, I'm getting ready to write an offer, but I don't see the HOA addendum. If there's an HOA, I don't see the condo rider. If there's, if it's a condominium, I don't see the lead-based paint if it was built before 78. I mean, it's not your responsibility to have the buyer sign those before the seller has had the seller fill them out. The seller needs to fill them out first because it's a disclosure to the buyer. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Property taxes. So just know that the property taxes are estimated and that their property taxes are going to be raised when they purchase the home. So a lot of times, property taxes don't get raised. They don't do an update to the assessments until a new purchase happens. So whatever the seller was paying today is not going to be what your buyer is going to pay tomorrow, because the purchase price is going to have increased during the amount of time that when the seller bought it to when your buyer buys it. So just make sure that their taxes are going to go up. And title's usually pretty good about telling them that as well. That, the taxes are estimated, and it's definitely not going to be, if they go look, in public documents and see, oh, taxes are only $500. Well, hopefully they're looking to see what the assessed value is, because usually it's considerably lower than what the purchase price they just offered was. FIRPTA, again, says that if it's a foreign person selling their home, they have to inform the buyer in writing. And again, this is something that I don't have a lot of experience in. So we would want to make sure that we, seek legal advice if we're dealing with a foreign seller. Seller's disclosure, while it is not Florida mandated that a seller has to do a seller's disclosure, it is required by Brix. So if you are representing a seller and it is not new construction, then you must have your seller fill out a seller's disclosure. Now, if they choose to refuse, then what I would do is I would open the seller's disclosure, put at the top seller refused to complete, and have them initial it. Cover your butt. Property maintenance. So except for ordinary wear and tear and casualty loss, sellers shall maintain the property, including but not limited to lawn, shrubbery, and pool, in the condition as of the effective date. So you don't expect to purchase a new home and then walk up and be like, oh my goodness, they've not mowed the yard in 30 days. That's not acceptable. So if you're representing the seller, make sure that you point this section of the contract out to them. They still have to maintain the property as of the date of the effective date. So if you went and looked at the pool and the pool was sparkling and beautiful and blue, and you go to the final walkthrough and it's green and moldy and gross, that is not okay. And you can delay closing for that. Okay, so the main difference between the as-is contract and the regular FAR is this section right here. So this is the buyer's get out of jail free card. They have a right to inspect, right to cancel built in to the as-is contract. In the regular FAR, it does not exist. So on a regular contract, if you're writing one for your buyer, you need to explain to them that there is no out in that contract unless they add the right to inspect, right to cancel addendum so that they're aware, okay? So this basically says that if for any reason they had a bad dream that this house was going to be, horrible for them, or they drove down the street and all of a sudden, after the contract is, binding, they decide, oh, yeah, I really don't like that big pothole in the road. For any reason whatsoever during these 15 days or whatever amount of time you put in here, they are able to walk away from this contract. No questions asked. Okay. But one thing I will say is you have to make sure that if they're canceling, that you fill out that cancellation agreement and send it prior to midnight on the date that this expires. So again, make sure that you're keeping track of all of your dates because this one is important, okay? And the other thing that this isn't in the contract, but this is something just to be aware of especially if you're a newer agent. So if you are a newer agent or any agent, I guess is what I want to say. We usually as buyers agents work with the lender to get home insurance quotes. So for home insurance for our buyers. And one of the things that I really, really strive to do, and I encourage all of you to do it as well, is to make sure that you have a policy selected before your inspection period ends. And the reason for that is, so let's say you do your inspections and it's an as-is contract. You're not going to ask for repairs. The appraisal is not back yet because most of the time your appraisal will not be back prior to your inspection period ending. It's only happened once where it worked out perfectly for me. Normally your appraisal will not be back. So you don't know at this point, let's say if it's VA or FHA, what the appraiser is going to ask for. And you don't know if you haven't already submitted for quotes for your insurance, what the insurance company is going to require. So if you have an older roof, if you have a hot water heater that's over 10 years old, if you have aluminum wiring, if you have an HVAC system that's pushing 12 years, the insurance company can come back and say, we're not going to insure you. Those are going to have to be replaced. You need to know that within these 15 days. Because if the seller, again, it's an as-is contract, the seller has either told you we're not making repairs, which means it all falls on the buyer, or the buyer is saying, I'm not asking for repairs, that's why I wrote an as-is contract. The buyer may have to assume the cost to be able to fix those things in order to get home insurance. Now, I will tell you that is leverage. So for instance, if you send out for 3 quotes, that's typically what my lender does. She sends out for 3 different quotes. Most of the time, they'll all come back with the same. Nope, the roof's got to be replaced. Nope, the HVAC's got to be replaced. Nope, the hot water heater has to be replaced. You can forward, I get those quotes back. I forward those 3 quotes from 3 separate insurance companies to the listing agent. And I'm like, hey, listen, I know we wrote an as-is contract. However, these issues are preventing my buyer, which will prevent any buyer from being able to get insurance because of the roof or the HVAC or whatever. And so then it gives you a little bit more leverage that, hey, we're already into this contract. It would be really great if your seller would work with us and figure out a way to fix these items because they need to be fixed for anybody to get financing, not just to get home insurance, which again, you can't get financing without home insurance. So if you have this beforehand and the seller comes back and says, no, I'm not fixing anything, you wrote an as-is contract, I don't care, somebody will be able to find insurance somewhere else, then your buyer is able to walk. If they can't or don't want to pay for whatever the insurance company is saying has to be fixed in order to get home insurance, they can walk free and clear. So it's just another way to be more proactive to make sure that you're kind of trying to line things up so that they know. Okay, walk through an inspection. So basically, if you are representing the seller, you have to tell your seller that they have to be able to provide access for the buyers to do their inspections and their final walkthrough and the appraisal. So the as-is contract on permits basically just says that the seller's obligation is to cooperate to be able to close out the permits. But it's basically the buyer's responsibility, and the seller has to expend 0 money to do that. Now, in most instances, I would say it's usually just a simple phone call. The roofing contractor forgot to close out the permit, and all the seller has to do is to call the roofing company and be like, hey, there's an open permit. And The roofing company calls and closes it, and it's no big deal. But I did have an instance where a pool permit had not been closed out. And in that instance, it was because the final inspection of the pool had not been completed. And the reason that it hadn't been completed was because the seller had, in order to meet the Florida statutes, they either had to install a fence around the pool, an enclosure around the pool, or put in a pool alarm and change all of the boards on their fences to the opposite side so that there wasn't basically a ladder. They had put the good side of the boards on the inside of the fence, which the cross beams were on, let's say, their neighbor's side. So it kind of made a ladder for anybody wanting to climb over and get access to the pool. And that's illegal in Florida. So there was a lot of work that, had I not written it into the contract, that the seller would pay for any permits or code violations at the seller's expense prior to closing, then my buyers would have been on the hook in order to close out that pool permit. Okay. So when you're representing the buyer or the seller, you should be checking to see what permits are open, if there are any. If I'm the listing agent, I'm doing that before I take my listing, and I'm going to my listing presentation and I'm saying, hey, I noticed that there are three permits open. Looks like most of them are no big deal, but I am going to need you to resolve that so that when we go under contract, it's not something that's going to delay us. Okay. And I make sure, and I stay on them to make sure that those are taken care of. And as the buyer, you cannot expect that the seller's agent is always going to do that. In fact, most cases, they probably don't. So do your due diligence for the buyer and make sure that you're checking permits to find out what's open, and then write that in additional comments that the seller, and I have the verbiage for you. So if you need that verbiage, please call me. But so that the seller is going to be responsible for expending any money that would be associated to close out any code violations and or permitting. Okay. It's very important. Okay. Let's see. Again, this just talks about what an escrow agent is. I think most of you probably know. If you don't, please read this. Talks about professional advice and broker liability. This basically says we're not attorneys and we're not accountants. And so anything that is outside of our lane, we are definitely going to make sure that we're referring, because we want to make sure that we're giving our buyers the best opportunity to get the knowledge that they need to move forward with this contract and feel comfortable. Buyer default. It talks about what buyer default means, what that is, seller default, what that is, and the processes for disputes. Okay, so make sure that you understand that number one, buyer default and seller default survives the closing or termination of this contract. That means that this is still applicable even if the contract is closed or been terminated. Okay. Dispute resolution. It tells you right here exactly what happens if there is a dispute. They have 10 days after the date of conflicting demands for the deposit to reach an attempt to dispute. If it's with the title company is not going to release the money unless they have buyer and seller both sign. So if nobody wants to sign, or if both parties don't want to sign in an agreement of who gets the money, then they're probably going to have to go to mediation and or arbitration or seek legal counsel. Okay. So make sure that you understand that. And again, this paragraph here also survives closing. So this is something that would happen even after the fact. Okay. Depending on the outcome of 15 or 16, it's going to say, the parties will equally split mediation fee. In any litigation permitted by this contract, the prevailing party, so the party that wins, shall be entitled to recover from the non-prevailing party fees, including reasonable attorney fees incurred in the conducting of the litigation. So make sure that your buyer and or seller are aware that if they decide to litigate, unless their case is strong, if they lose, they're not only out the money and the time for their attorney, they could be out for the other attorney as well. Okay. Nobody wants to be litigious, but we live in a litigious society right now. And so we need to try to be proactive and make sure that, like I said, you're documenting everything, you're being communicative on everything, and that will really help. Okay, so these are all your standards. These are like definitions. Make sure that you read through these and you understand what they mean. I'm going to hit on a few of them. Again, we talked about the survey. Do not wait for the survey for the seller to provide it 5 days before closing. If you do that and there's an issue, I promise you it will extend your closing date, and everybody will be grouchy. Lease information. So this goes back to if there's a lease that you filled out at the very beginning of the contract. This talks about the estoppel letter that has to be provided by the tenant. It gives all of the dates in here. So if you are doing a listing or you have a buyer that's buying a home that has a lease active, you want to make sure that you are reading and understanding this section, because there are dates and timeframes in there that you have to comply with. Liens, it's talking about the title company will do a municipal lien search. So anything that pops up on the title commitment, you will be able to see it, and then you'll have to work with the title company and or the seller to be able to get those taken care of so that you can move forward. Time is of the essence. It's exactly what that means. Time is of the essence. All of these dates and timeframes matter, and they're important, and they should be important to your buyer and to your seller, to the listing agent and to the buyer's agent. Okay. This contract is based on calendar days. So it's based on calendar days where the property is located. So if you have a buyer that is in California and you give them 3 days to wire the money, California is 3 hours ahead of us. They need to make sure that they understand that they are working on Central Time for all of their time frames, okay? And not California time. Because midnight here, when the deadline actually expires, is 9 p.m. there. Midnight there is 3 a.m. here. They've missed their deadline. So make sure that when you're communicating with out-of-state buyers or out-of-country buyers, that you are asking them, does this give you enough time? Especially for the earnest money, right? You don't want to start off the contract and be in breach automatically. So make sure that it's not a holiday in a foreign country that you may not be aware of, where the banks are not open. Make sure that, because that has actually happened. That's been an actual example of an agent that I knew. She had a buyer who was in Peru, and it was some religious holiday. And on the third day, he called her and he's like, it's a national holiday here. The banks aren't open. So they had to extend. And it just makes you look like you didn't do your due diligence up front as the buyer's agent if you're not checking all of this stuff prior. So again, the other thing that I want to say is, so again, like we talked about, if one of your dates outside of time and acceptance and outside of the effective date, all of the other dates, if they end on a Saturday or a Sunday or a holiday, it defaults to the next day at midnight. So for instance, if your 15-day inspection period ends on a Saturday, it really doesn't end on a Saturday. It ends on Monday at midnight. So you would have until Monday at midnight to be able to reject the offer, or to cancel your contract. Now, I don't suggest waiting until the very last minute to do anything, but that's when the official deadline would be. Now, if Monday happens to be a holiday, which happens a lot here in the United States, then Tuesday would be your deadline date. So make sure that you're paying attention to your dates as well. Force majeure, that does play a role here in Florida with the hurricanes and the flooding that we have. So again, it's just basically saying that the buyer and seller should not be required to exercise or perform any right or obligation under this contract or be liable to each other for damages so long as performance or non-performance of the right or the obligation basically was disrupted or delayed because of a force majeure event. And it goes down to explain what those are and then how long is a reasonable time to extend the closing date, and it's up to 7 days. Again, if that happens, make sure that you're doing an addendum to extend the contract. so that both parties are saying that they are absolutely aware and why you're extending it, and get signatures. It's saying basically the seller is going to provide marketable title, location, closing documents, FinCEN. Just make sure that you read all of these. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. It talks about the escrow closing procedure, proration and credits. So like if there's taxes or HOA dues or condo dues or any other type of proration, it's basically going to be the buyer will pay from the time they accept it until the end of the term, and the seller will pay from the beginning of the year until closing date. Okay, so they're not going to pay if HOA dues are $600 a year. The seller's only going to pay for the time that they lived in it, and then the buyer's going to pay for the rest of it. And it's a proration that's on the Alta. That's what that means. 1031 exchange. Again, if you're not familiar with this, make sure that you get with legal representation for your seller and or your buyer to make sure that you are providing. And most of the time they should have an advocate that they're working with if they're doing a 1031 exchange, and then they would just be a partner with you to get that property either bought or sold. Let's see. Okay, so now I want to talk about addenda. Okay, so all of the addenda listed here are the addenda that you can use with this contract. So you will see here that it does not say right to inspect, right to cancel addenda, because it's already built into this contract. What I'm saying is make sure when you're adding riders that you have the riders that are applicable to this specific contract. And they're all numbered, okay? A through CC, okay? There are riders for the CRISP contract. There's addendums for the CRISP contract. There are other documents that go with the CRISP contract. Make sure that when you are pulling any other document that becomes contractual, whether it's an addendum or whatever, that you're using the one for the FAR bar, or you're using the one for the FAR bar as is, okay? It's very important. And I will tell you that there are agents and there are brokerages that have compliance departments that if you submit the wrong one, because the verbiage in these tie back to the different sections and verbiage in the riders, okay? And if you submit the wrong one, they absolutely will reject it and send it back to you. And how embarrassing will that be if you have to tell your buyer, oh, I used the wrong addenda? It makes you look like you don't know what you're doing, okay? So I will show you, I'll show you what I mean by that in just a second. Okay, so again, the most applicable ones that you're probably going to use is condo rider, HOA rider, FHA, VA, appraisal contingency, and lead-based paint. Okay, those are the primary ones that you will use. Sometimes you're going to see post-closing occupancy, and you might see sale of buyer's property. Okay, so make sure that if you have a buyer that has to sell their property, that you are including this rider. If you don't, then they do not have the contingency to back out if their home does not sell, because you didn't make it aware to the lender or to the seller that they had a contingency to sell their home. And so loan approval was given to them based on their current situation without them knowing that a property had to be sold. Okay, so if they have a property to sell and they have to sell it before they can buy, you must include Rider V. It gives them the contingency to back out if by some chance their home does not sell. Okay, so that's really important. The other one that you might see, again, this will be on the tax record as a non-ad valorem. So PACE is, oh my goodness, what does it stand for? Hold on just a second. I've got it written down. It's a loan that it's property assessed clean energy. And it's basically financed through the state for homeowners to basically like hurricane proof their home or get energy efficient windows or get a new roof. It's a type of assistance that you apply for, but you don't pay for it like a regular loan. You pay for it as an assessment on your taxes. So it is very important that if you are representing the seller and you know that you checked their tax record and you see that they have a PACE loan, you need to explain to them that that's not transferable to the buyer and that that will have to be paid off and come out of their proceeds at closing. And as a buyer, you just want to be aware that there is a PACE loan on there and making sure that the seller is aware that they are going to have to take care of that at closing, that that is not something that's going to be transferred to the buyer. Okay. So down here, these were the additional terms that I wrote in on this particular contract. Again, we are not attorneys. Attorneys here in Florida discourage writing too much into additional terms because, again, you're not an attorney. So you want to make sure what you're writing is very clear and very succinct, and that if it were put in front of a judge, that a judge would know exactly what you were saying. Okay. And if you need help writing anything, please feel free to reach out. That's why I'm here, or reach out to your mentor too. Okay. So in this situation, buyer to allow seller to choose title and buyer to pay for owner's title policy and charges as defined in section 9CI. Okay. So in this situation, we were trying to make our offer more competitive. So we offered to pay title. However, to further strengthen that, we said, okay, we'll pay title, but we'll let you choose. All right. Trying to give a warm fuzzy to the seller. And then again, be specific as defined in 9CI. Okay. And then the other thing that we tried to do was to make our offer stronger was we decided to pay for the seller's doc stamp tax and surtax on the deed as listed in section 9, line 137. And you can calculate this yourself. So if you have a buyer that's trying to make their offer more competitive and they wanted to pay the doc stamps, it's 0.7% of the purchase price. It also pulls up when you do the seller net sheet. You can pull it up and see what their doc stamp would be so that you know what dollar amount to put in here. Again, this was just another way to make the offer stronger. Okay, so then you have your buyer sign and you date it, and then you send it off to the listing agent. Now, the listing agent can come back, and I've seen it done two ways, and I'll tell you which way I prefer because I think it's cleaner. So I had a listing agent come back, and she literally marked up the entire contract. So she changed things here. She crossed out this price. She changed the closing date, and she just marked through it and wrote, and then everybody has to go back, the buyer and the seller, and initial every little change on every little page. Okay. And then there were some initials that were missed. And so then we had to go back and do it again until every single change was initialed by both buyer and seller. And so if you have two buyers and two sellers, you've got four people that are going to every little change and having to initial anything that was changed. So what I recommend is the clean way to do it. And that is to click down here. The seller counters the buyer's counteroffer, and then open a counteroffer and be specific to the line that you want to change and write in the change. And then the buyer and seller only have to sign one time. Now, you can do counteroffers back and forth as many times as you want, and a lot of times you're really only maybe negotiating over the price. So, for instance, in the condo that I had listed, we went back and forth verbally between the listing agent and I for a whole day before we finally got the buyer and seller to agree to a price. So we didn't do 10 counteroffers back and forth. We negotiated verbally until we got the buyer and seller to say, yep, that's a good price, write it up. And we did one counteroffer. Do it however you feel like makes sense. But I prefer that you don't mark up the contract because it really muddies it. And again, if you're missing initials and stuff, it can be very confusing. Okay, so now I want to show you what I'm talking about when we're looking at the templates. Okay, so hold on a second. Okay, so I've got a dummy contract loop here. Okay, so if you go to, let's say we want to add an addendum. We want to make sure that we're adding the correct addendum. So you click Florida Interactive Forms and type in addendum. Okay. This one says FAR. That means it's for the FAR bar. Okay. That's the one that you want to use. Okay. And so if you click that and you open it, oops. This is what it should look like, okay? And it says FAR. It means it's for the FAR bar. Now, if we go back and do the same thing, and you see this one that says, where is it? Maybe it's this one. One of these is for the crisp. Okay. This one that says addendum to contract for residential sale and purchase. See how it says crisp, CRSP? You cannot use that with your regular FAR bar contract or the as is contract. Okay. So any rider or any addendum that says crisp at the bottom is the wrong one. You need to go find the one that's for the regular FAR bar. Okay. And if you have any questions on that, please feel free to reach out and let me know, and I will do everything that I can to help make sure that you're getting the right document. But again, we try to keep track of it here, but again, the girls in Oklahoma City are really busy and they're not super familiar. An addendum looks like an addendum unless you check that little very box down at the bottom. But I can tell you the bigger brokerages that have compliance departments like EXP or Keller Williams, they will absolutely send that back to you if you catch the right person on the right day, and they'll tell you need to rewrite the addendum. And again, it just makes you look not professional when you have to go back and request signatures on another addendum to your client because you didn't pay attention in the first place. Okay, so that's really the as is. The residential, again, is the same for the most part. The difference would be there is no right to inspect, right to cancel. So if your client wants to be able to have the opportunity to walk away for no reason, then they need to add that rider onto the contract. Neither contract in Florida has the appraisal contingency. So again, if your buyer is worried that they may have to purchase a property that did not appraise for their purchase price, then you want to make sure that you're including the appraisal contingency as well. But that's pretty much it. So if you guys have any questions, always reach out, and I hope this was a huge help. Thanks so much.